Okay, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Irish Wildlife Trust webinar. My name is Kieran, and I'm staff here at the Irish Wildlife Trust. We're a biodiversity charity that works to protect nature in Ireland. And tonight we're coming to you from Montreal, where our campaigns officer Porg is at the COP. So, as always, the Irish Wildlife Trust is always looking for support of the public for our work and our advocacy. So if you wish to support our work, webinars like this and other areas of our work, feel free to go onto our website where you can join us and support our charity. You'll be able to watch back this webinar. We'll post it on our YouTube page and you'll find it there or on our website in the next couple of days. So, and then just to say, with this webinar, if you have any questions throughout the webinar, you can just pop them in the Q&A, which is at the bottom of your screen. That's the best place to put your questions. I'll keep an eye on that and we can put those to Porg at the end. The chat you can use just for general chit chat throughout, but if you have an actual question you want Porg to address, just stick that in the Q&A and I'll keep an eye on that. So that's a bit of housekeeping. With that done, I think it's time to welcome Porg. Thank you for joining us from Montreal.
Hi, Kieran. Thanks for that. I will just go ahead now and share my screen. And apologies again to everyone at home for the technical difficulties. Okay, are you seeing that?
I'm seeing the slide. Yeah.
Okay,
not in
full screen now.
Now it's in presentation mode. Yeah, it looks great.
Great. Okay, I'll get going. Okay.
Thanks,
right. So good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today. As Kieran said, I am here in Montreal. I've been at the COP. It started here last week. So I appreciate it hasn't been getting an awful lot of coverage around the place. So I thought it'd be useful to have this webinar to try and raise the profile of it, to explain what it is and why it's important. So our story really starts 30 years ago, believe it or not, in Rio de Janeiro. It was 1992. It was the Earth Summit, which at the time was the biggest event the world had ever seen for the environment. It attracted world leaders from most of the world's countries. It got a huge amount of press, and it came after probably 2 decades at that stage of increasing anxiety around the direction the Earth was going in terms of the various environmental pressures. And the upshot of that meeting was 3 global conventions. One of them was on the climate. That's the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. One of them was on desertification. And the one that we're going to talk about this evening was on biodiversity. It's called the Convention on Biological Diversity. And each one of these conventions have a series of routine meetings. And those meetings are called Conference of Parties, or COPs for short. So that's why we have COPs, and the different numbers just are assigned sequentially. So we're in COP15 now. That means it's the 15th COP. The COP just gone was the 27th for climate, and there's a COP for desertification. So you might say, well, if they wanted to design a system to confuse people, they've done pretty well, because I think a lot of people have been scratching their heads wondering, what do you mean there's a COP going on in Canada? Didn't we just have one in Egypt? So that's why we have COP15. And of course, I think a lot of people are probably saying, although okay, it's 30 years too late, but it might have been a better idea just to have had one COP for all of these environmental issues, because it's very hard, obviously, to attract attention after particularly only a couple of weeks after the COP in Egypt that had all these world leaders and so on. But that is the background to it. It also maybe gives you an idea of basically how long we've been talking about these issues for. 30 years is a very long time. And the last significant COP for biodiversity was in Japan in 2012, or maybe it was 2020. Sorry, 2010. over 10 years ago, and that was in Japan. And at that meeting, they said that the world's government said they were going to end biodiversity loss by 2020, but actually that didn't happen, as we know. And actually, none of the targets that were set in Japan at that particular COP were met fully, not one. So that is the background, anyway, to what is going on here in Montreal. And of course, just the bigger picture, really. I mean, it's very easy to be cynical about these meetings and to say, oh, they're just talking shops, or political circuses or whatever. But the background to why we're here, couldn't be more important. And I'll just put up two graphics there to show people, just what has happened basically since we started having these COPs. You see on the right-hand side is the Living Planet Index, or as many of us prefer to refer to it as the Dying Planet Index, which shows that the populations of vertebrates, which is mammals, birds, amphibians, and fish, has collapsed basically since the 1970s. And really our graph starts in the 1970s because that's when we started having good data to work on. It doesn't necessarily mean that biodiversity started to collapse in 1970. Certainly it didn't. But even in that short space of time, and that basically is my lifetime. I was born in 1973. So in my lifetime, the populations of all of these animals has basically plummeted. Now you'll see it has plateaued in the last couple of years. And maybe that's good news to an extent, that maybe it's not continuing to fall exponentially, but there are other problems that we need to worry about. Of course, because it only looks at vertebrates, we're ignoring whole groups of species like invertebrates, which we simply just don't have the data for to draw a graph like this. But on the left-hand side, you will see a good indication as to why we have this problem. And it really shows you the change in distribution and biomass of the world's mammals. So mammals are basically the big things that we readily recognize, like elephants and rhinos. And we see that the total biomass of mammals has absolutely exploded, but most of that is humans and our livestock, and less than 2% of the wild mammals on land today by weight are wild animals. And I mean, that can tell you really an awful lot of things about how our ecosystems are in a state of collapse. You can't have healthy natural ecosystems if you're taking all the animals out of them. So that gives you an overview really of the background to why we're here and why dealing with biodiversity is urgent. Now, another reason, and for many of us, I mean, I think we do understand that biodiversity is important, but I think biodiversity has struggled really to get the attention it deserves and the attention that it needs at the world stage. Now, the environment in general has struggled for a very long time to get any kind of attention, but we have seen in the last 5 years or so the climate agenda rising, and that's obviously very welcome, but it has left biodiversity behind. And so people can understand about warming temperatures and rising sea levels, but I think a lot of people still struggle to understand why biodiversity matters. And maybe people think that, oh, well, we're worried for the elephants and for the whales and the rhinos and everything, because wouldn't it be sad for them if they went extinct? And indeed it would, but it would also be completely catastrophic for the rest of life on Earth. And these are just two graphics that I thought might help us understand why that is. And one on the left-hand side shows you some work that has been done by academics in recent years to try and identify the Earth's tipping points. So tipping points are points in time beyond which there's no recovery. Basically, it's like if you could imagine a chair and you lean back on the chair and you let go, you will go back to your seated position. But there's a point at which you lean back too far. So when you let go, you don't go back to your position. You actually fall flat on the floor, and then you can't get back up again. And that's basically what a tipping point is. And we risk going over a number of important tipping points. Now, of course, defining where those are is difficult, but you can see some of them are to do with, very much to do with climate, like melting of ice sheets, thermal currents in the ocean, and so on. But many of them are also related to vitally important ecosystems. So particularly, you see there on the Amazon rainforest, the boreal forest. These are the largest forests in the world. And the tropical coral reefs, for instance, and the ocean system more widely is at risk of collapse. So these are all intimately interconnected. And of course, if these ecosystems collapse at a global level, I mean, this is just catastrophic for humanity and for our civilization. And it won't be possible, I think, to say, oh, well, this was because of climate change or it was because of biodiversity loss, because the two are so intimately connected. But you can see the role that biodiversity plays is absolutely fundamental in maintaining the habitable earth that we've enjoyed for the last 10 or 15,000 years. And this is confirmed by work from the Stockholm Resilience Center. This is the graphic I'm showing on the right-hand side. And this is showing what the planetary boundaries are. So the work here was basically to try and explain that, you know, our safe living space for humans lies within planetary boundaries. You know, we rely on fresh water, we rely on a stable climate, we rely on stable natural ecosystems. But you can see from that graphic that we've overshot the boundaries for biosphere integrity is the one maybe most relevant to what we're talking about. Also land system change, which is converting forests into farmland most of the time. And biogeochemical flows at the bottom is related to pollution, in particular the phosphorus and the nitrogen that is causing drastic changes in freshwater ecosystems, but also in many coastal and estuarine ecosystems. So these are all intimately linked. And so biodiversity is absolutely the fundamental platform on which we have built our civilization, and all life depends on it. So, so that is why we really can't just focus on climate change and greenhouse gas emissions on their own if we are to deal with the crisis that we face. So that brings us back maybe to what we're doing here in Montreal, and why is this meeting important? I put up this photograph I took at the COP Climate Summit in Glasgow a couple of years ago. It was last year, actually, and it was just a nice painting that was on the wall. You can see that the slogan on the girl's T-shirt is 1.5 to stay alive, and that refers to the agreement that was reached in Paris in 2015, where the international community agreed that we should not exceed 1.5 degrees of warming, and certainly stay well below 2 degrees of warming. And that was a very important decision, because what happened then was that an awful lot of the academic and the policy effort went into deciding, okay, how are we going to actually achieve that goal? How are we going to stay within 1.5 degrees? And there was all kinds of modeling done on our energy system, on our food system, and the other sources of greenhouse gases, to see what the various pathways could be towards staying within this 1.5 degree goal. We don't have anything like that for biodiversity, and that's a big problem, because what are the policymakers working towards? I mean, we know that we have to stop extinction and reverse the loss of biodiversity, but what does that mean when we are making decisions about how land is to be used, how public money is to be spent, how we're going to produce food, how we're going to manage water? All of these different parameters are very difficult to manage if we don't know what our ultimate goal is in terms of stabilizing ecosystems. And so that's what they're trying to decide here today. And they're referring to it as a global biodiversity framework. Now, of course, the 1.5 degrees also highlights another important problem, in that nature doesn't lend itself to a very easy metric like we have for temperature, because basically the temperature is what matters, and we're trying to keep the warming below that particular temperature. But biodiversity is complex, it's moving, it's mostly invisible. We can't measure it very well, and it's difficult to understand. So we can't come up with a nice headline figure that we can all support like that. And I know an awful lot of discussion over the last years was indeed around this. Should we be working towards a headline goal, about this amount of extinction or whatever? But that's not possible with biodiversity. So the agreement that is being discussed here is basically working on a number of targets that would be equivalent to 1.5, but would be taken in the round as giving us a goal towards which we can work, and then that would allow us to establish the pathway, because otherwise, really, we're in a policy vacuum if we don't have that pathway. And that's why this meeting is completely critically important, because if we come out of this meeting next week without an agreement, which I think would be absolutely inconceivable and disastrous, or with an agreement that really doesn't meet the scientific requirements that we know have to happen, then we're going to be, basically deliberately driving ourselves off a cliff. And so the meeting, or the agreement that is reached this weekend, or maybe early next week, is so completely critically important for deciding what the next steps are going to be. Now, I will preface all of that by saying that obviously, if you've been familiar with what's been going on with the Paris Agreement, you'll know that we haven't exactly been implementing it. So implementation is a different thing in a way, and I'll talk about that later. But certainly from the global policy and scientific perspective, this deal is absolutely critical. So what are they trying to agree? So actually the draft text for the agreement is only 12 pages long. It's not an enormous tome. I think it has been broken down into 15 targets. And it's a pretty easy document to read as it stands at the moment. Of course, it's just draft at the moment. But these will give you an indication of what the discussions are about here in Montreal. The one I think that has gotten the most attention is what's called 30 by 30 for short. And this has been a campaign to protect 30% of land and sea for nature by the end of this decade. Now, this started, or at least I think it got an awful lot of attention after the late, great Edward O. Wilson published, which I think is his last book out of many, which proposed setting aside half of the earth for nature and for natural ecosystems. And this has been backed up by a lot of science since then. And the message from scientists at the moment is we absolutely have to protect a minimum of 30% of land and sea by 2030. But this has been controversial, and it's been controversial for a number of reasons. Number one is because the way we have done conservation of nature over the last century or so really hasn't been particularly successful. And that is because it started, nature conservation has roots in colonialism. And in those days, when the Americans wanted to, or the British indeed in Africa wanted to create national parks, they basically kicked all the people out and drew a metaphorical fence around these areas. And while that would probably work for nature, it doesn't work for people, and it has created an awful lot of unquiet and upset, and particularly fear among indigenous peoples, pastoral peoples, local people, I suppose you could term it, believing that they're going to be thrown off their land and their traditional livelihoods are going to be displaced in the name of nature conservation. So that, I think, is why it has been particularly controversial. But so that, to me, that really points to how we do conservation. It doesn't negate the need for protected areas. And protected areas are known to work. There are very many examples of them working, but they tend to work when they respect the rights of local people and they involve local people, and so on. So that really is the key message there. I was at a talk this week, and one of the speakers was from the Philippines, and he was raising these points. But then when those indigenous people were able to turn it back on the policymakers to say, okay, we can talk about protecting nature if you can protect our land rights. Well, then the conversation was able to move forward because the local people felt that their futures were also secured. Of course, also the other thing is that where the 30% is chosen is very, very important. We saw on a previous slide that the Amazon rainforest is absolutely critical to the stability of the Earth system. Now, currently, about 80% of the Amazon is left. Some of that is degraded. I think another 10 or 15% is degraded. But obviously, if you were aiming to protect 30% of the Amazon, this would be completely catastrophic. So where we pick the 30% is also vitally important. We need the 30% that has the most biodiversity. Now, the European Union has signed up to this goal of 30 by 30. Ireland has signed up to a high ambition coalition, and the aim of the high ambition coalition is to achieve 30 by 30, but Ireland actually has not signed up to protecting 30% of our land by 2030. We have signed up to protecting 30% of the sea, and there's been some good news on that today in terms of creating more marine protected areas, but we haven't signed up to protecting 30% of our land. And if we were to do that, and I think we should, really the critically important places on land for our biodiversity are our peatlands, are our forests, or what's left of them, or allowing them to expand, and our rivers and other wetlands. So I think we wouldn't have any problem coming up with 30%, but again, the critical thing would be creating the mechanisms to make that work for people on the ground. Now, the other thing, of course, is that even if you did protect 30% of the land and sea by 2030, what does that mean for the other 70%? And I suppose it's the nature of the way these debates happen, that if you start talking about protecting a certain percentage of land, people automatically assume that, oh, well, that's fine, you can do whatever you want in the other bits of land. We can continue to destroy nature in the other 70% or the other 50%. And of course, we can't do that either. But it does make a distinction between where we need healthy functioning natural ecosystems and where we are using land for human needs, and particularly food, but also forestry and fisheries. But agriculture is critically important. And so one of the aims that is being discussed here is this sentence that you see at the top: ensuring that all areas under agriculture, aquaculture, and forestry are managed sustainably. And of course, we know in Ireland that we're a very long way from managing our land sustainably. In fact, some of the statistics are particularly stark. Globally speaking, agriculture is responsible for 80% of deforestation, about a third of our global greenhouse gas emissions, 70% of freshwater use, and 70% of terrestrial biodiversity loss. And we also know that fishing at sea has drastically and negatively altered about 66% of the ocean surface. So developing systems that where we can produce food, produce other non-food products like timber, and also fishing absolutely is critical to meeting our biodiversity, but also our climate goals. It has been repeated absolutely ad nauseum really here, certainly from some quarters, that if we cannot transform our food system, we will not meet our biodiversity and our climate objectives. So those things are absolutely critically important and absolutely entirely relevant for us at home in Ireland in terms of how we use our land and our sea. Now, they would be what I would consider maybe the really headline issues that we need to be watching out for. And some of the solutions are also being discussed. I've been at a couple of talks here this week about agroecology, which is about how to produce food that isn't so reliant on chemicals and inputs, and more or less democratizes food production to give more control to local people over how food is produced. So a lot of these solutions are already there, but haven't been rolled out. But some of the other things that I wanted to bring to your attention that I think are relevant, particularly to us in Ireland, are related to, for instance, the use of subsidies. So we spend an enormous amount of public money every year propping up various industries. Now, subsidies are, I mean, they've been around for a very long time. They tend to be used to, at least the intention, the original intention of them was to help local people, basically to prevent free market forces just doing away with their jobs or doing away with things that are in the greater public interest. So we subsidize public transport, for instance, which is an example of a good subsidy that is of great public benefit. But an awful lot of our subsidies are damaging to nature. And the figure worldwide stretches into the trillions of dollars. And most of this is to do with land use and forestry and fishing and fossil fuels. But particularly from a biodiversity point of view, the subsidies that are given to agriculture are particularly damaging because they promote land clearance, they promote nutrient runoff, and they promote overproduction in some cases. As we see in Ireland, we are overproducing certain types of food to the great cost to nature. And so one of the goals here is to reduce harmful subsidies by 500. That should be 500 billion. I must check that. 500 million euro, possibly a year. Anyway, the executive secretary of the Convention on Biological Diversity was very keen to stress yesterday that reducing that figure was not insignificant. Now, the idea is not that we just pull the plug on subsidies. A lot of people rely for their income on subsidies. So the words that are being used here are being repurposed or redirected. So instead of using public money to promote things that are harmful to nature, we could use that money to do things that are regenerative and restorative, but also protecting livelihoods. Of course, it's still hugely controversial, as we saw in our debate in Ireland about the Common Agricultural Policy, which after 5 years of debate will see 9.8 billion euro of public money going to farmers over the next 5 years. And very, very little of that is going to go towards addressing the climate and biodiversity emergency. That would be the really big one in Ireland. Of course, we also spend hundreds of millions of euro a year of EU subsidies on fishing. And we're about to launch into a forestry program that will spend 1.3 billion euro of taxpayers' money on forestry. And there's no sense that these industries are transforming in any kind of a planned way to make them compatible with climate and biodiversity goals. But if an agreement is reached here, it would help to put more of a spotlight on it and more pressure on it, and that would surely be a welcome thing. Now, there's also targets around restoration of land and halting extinctions. We see mention of urban areas. This isn't all about rural areas or places far out to sea. We need nature in our urban spaces and access to green space. is also under discussion, which many of us will closely relate to after the COVID pandemic, where I think we found in Ireland that our access to green space is very poor. And even sometimes when you do have green space, the quality of the green space is very poor. It is low biodiversity. It is not aesthetically pleasing. And this is a huge consequence to our mental health as well as our physical health. There's also targets on alien invasive species, reducing pollution and pesticide use. And a lot of these things are already contained within EU policies to do with our biodiversity strategy, farm to fork, things that you may be familiar with that have already been announced by the European Union. So from a policy perspective, many of these things are already in place in the European Union. But a lot of our problem is that Ireland has now developed a habit of signing up to these goals and targets, and then announcing a couple of years later that they don't actually have any intention of meeting them. And we saw this first in 2015 when Taoiseach Enda Kenny went to the Paris summit on climate and said that Ireland was ready and determined to do our bit. And then outside of the meeting, he told reporters that he felt that the targets were unrealistic. We also saw last year Taoiseach Micheál Martin going to Glasgow and signing up to a commitment to reduce our methane emissions by 30% by 2030. And then a report in the Sunday Business Post last week said that the government is saying that that is also unrealistic and not feasible and can't be done. And so we've done the same with the 30 by 30 target, as I pointed out earlier. And so we really have got ourselves into a habit of, coming to these meetings, saying we're going to do stuff and then going home and basically doing nothing. And we do have to address that. And I'll mention that again by the end of the presentation. The last thing on this slide I wanted to talk about was the role of business. And I think this is really interesting, actually, because, and I spent a lot of the day yesterday going to fora on business for biodiversity. And here's the WWF yesterday at their press conference saying that they really welcomed the fact that there were more business leaders at this COP15 than ever before. And the chief of the WWF was very quick to point out that these were not lobbyists. Now, I would take that with an enormous pinch of salt. Of course, they're lobbyists. I mean, they're there to represent their interests no more than I'm a lobbyist at this event. The difference between me and a lot of these business leaders is that they do tend to get into rooms with influential people in a way that the NGOs don't. But I just wanted to maybe reflect for a moment on the role of businesses. Businesses obviously employ a lot of people. They're very good at delivering conveniences in our lives that we like, gadgets and nice experiences and so on. And they're also incredibly wealthy. Private finance has absolutely ballooned in recent years. And so there is a strong temptation for governments in particular to see the pot of money that businesses are holding on to and seeing if that can be somehow tapped into for biodiversity, because protecting nature is going to cost a lot of money, and we're going to have to give an awful lot of money, particularly to poorer countries who don't have any money in order to meet a lot of these goals. But I have to admit, I am very, very skeptical of this approach. Businesses come here, they are very good at sitting on panels and telling you how they think biodiversity is really important. One of the panels I was at yesterday had a representative of BP, the giant oil company, telling us that biodiversity was a high priority for them. And I mean, this just is incredible. BP is, in my view, is an ecological criminal, and they shouldn't even be allowing fossil fuel companies be beyond platforms like this, at meetings like this. But I guess for an awful lot of smaller businesses, and an awful lot of businesses are smaller, they're probably wondering what they can do. And I don't want to come across either as being overly negative of business. Businesses, of course, have a role to play. But I think one of the key targets they're trying to get over the line here in Montreal is what's called mandatory reporting for business. So businesses will have to report to their shareholders about their biodiversity risk, about their exposure to biodiversity risk. Now, this is also relevant in the climate sphere. I believe that there is already a mandatory disclosure for businesses to report on their climate risk, but moving that into biodiversity, I think would be very helpful. But then that is for businesses to address that risk to their own business model. And many companies are already doing that. They're already looking at their supply chains, their contractors and so on, and making sure that they're not, buying things from illegal deforestation or so on. And that's very welcome when companies do that. But that's very different, I think, to the idea that businesses will somehow start investing an awful lot of money in biodiversity protection. Because at the end of the day, if you have businesses that are for profit, and I mean, that's what businesses do, you have to be able to explain to them where their return on investment is going to come from. And so to my mind, the only way that you get a return on investment for nature is either by marketing, by investing in things and then being able to use that and telling people that you're doing things for nature, or through offsetting, which is where we've seen an awful lot of money appear in terms of using nature to suck carbon out of the air in order to allow for the continued burning of fossil fuels. And of course, offsetting is beset with problems. It's not regulated. Basically, it's not something that can be trusted at the moment. So this leaves us with an enormous gap then. And one thing that I've noticed hasn't come up for discussion at any of the meetings that I was at is how are we going to tax big businesses and regulate them so that the enormous profits that they're earning, let's say on the back of exploitation of nature, why can't we tax them and use that money for restoration of nature and also regulate them so that we are investing in controlling what they do, because I think that is the fundamental root of neoliberal capitalism, is basically allowing them what to do. But that would mean that governments would have to step up and show some leadership in this area. So I have one last slide for you. And really what I wanted to do, and particularly not just this webinar, but really by coming to Canada in the first place to attend this conference, was really to try to be able to communicate what it means for us back at home. I know that these conferences can, they're not only physically far away, but they're, they just seem quite abstract and not particularly relevant to what we're doing in Ireland. So I wanted to maybe dwell for a minute on what it does mean for Ireland. Now, we're fortunate enough that this year we're seeing quite a substantial delegation from the Department of Housing already over here. We're hoping Minister Malcolm Noonan will make it, weather permitting. He is due here tomorrow, I think, and he'll be here on Thursday. Welcome to see the Irish government being engaged. The Irish government negotiates as part of the European Union bloc, and so that is important. But having senior ministers here is important because that gives weight to your negotiating position if there are things that you want to change. But it's also, I think, very good for the morale of the staff that are here, that they know that they are working. And that their work is being supported. So I think the presence of a minister here is really important and welcome. But what we do negotiate with as part of the EU voice, and as I've said, the EU has already signed up to many of these targets. But we have to start translating these kinds of targets and goals into how we do business at home. And the way we do that through the Convention on Biological Diversity is through our National Biodiversity Action Plan. And that is out, well, it was out for public consultation, and it's due to be published next year. But we have been publishing, you see on the cover there, it's the 4th National Biodiversity Action Plan. So, I mean, you know, we've been making these plans now for many years, and basically they haven't gone anywhere. They don't come with a budget. There's no obligation on anybody to do anything. There's nobody's held to account for implementing it. There's no obligation on other government departments that are key to the delivery of targets to even read the plan, never mind actually do the things that it says in it. So these plans so far have been paper exercises, which are obviously useless and even a waste of everyone's time, really. But how do we change that narrative? How do we make these plans actually meaningful, and how do we go from talking about doing things to actually implementing them? So this is recognized actually in the treaty that is being, or in the agreement that's being negotiated here. And I took this sentence out from the early part of the text. And it says, it assumes that a whole of government and society approach is necessary to make the changes needed over the next 10 years as a stepping stone towards the achievement of the 2050 vision. In other words, we know that the deals that are made here are meaningless if they are not implemented. And in order for them to be implemented, we need all of government and all of society to be supportive of it. We're talking here about absolutely massive and transformative change. By definition, it's extremely difficult. And it only happens if you have all of society and all of the government supporting it. To date, these plans have only been produced by the National Parks and Wildlife Service, the Department of Agriculture, Food and Fisheries, and the Marine, which is probably the most important government department in terms of, you know, transitioning to sustainable food system, is not necessarily supportive of this. The Department of Health, for instance, I mean, biodiversity is a critical element of our physical and mental health. And yet they don't seem to be particularly interested in it. The Department of Finance, which will have to come up with the money for implementation, as well as the mechanisms for behavioral change through taxation, whether that's taxing corporations or taxing pollution. What do they think about these things? Are they supportive? Now, you know, if you're looking for optimism, you will see that the way the Climate Action Plan has been delivered has also run into the same trouble, and that is why we get these sectoral budgets and so on that are enshrined within the Climate Act, so that all government departments are on board. And we really urgently need that in Ireland as well. What we have been promoting is a Biodiversity Act, so that we have a Biodiversity Act alongside a Climate Act, and that just like it does for climate, that poses or imposes requirements on government departments to meet the targets, that there are mechanisms for oversight, so that the Oireachtas can hold the minister accountable for not meeting the targets or meeting them, and so on. So that whole of government approach at the moment is completely missing. Anybody who follows our work will know that our Minister for Agriculture is still going around the world selling our food as working with nature and perfectly sustainable, opposing marine protected areas, and so on. And so we have a disjointed government approach at the moment. But the last point I will make is about the all of society approach. And that's why I put up the picture here from the protest I was at last week, because it's not enough for governments to do things. You know, particularly we live in a democracy. Governments can't just do what they want. They can only do things with popular support from the people. We saw that during COVID, that the general public support for lockdown measures and vaccination and all that was absolutely critical to delivering on public safety. And it's exactly the same for environmental issues. So public protests are really important. Local community action is really important. I think our Citizens Assembly, which will finish its work next month, is really, really important in building that all of society approach. Because without it, we're doomed. And maybe this is also, it's also a foil to the people who say that COPs, these meetings are completely pointless talking shops. In a way, of course they are, if there's no implementation, or if the ministers of environment that are here go home and are being completely ignored by their ministers for agriculture and energy and finance, then they will remain talking shops. So, but also we have a really important role to play in helping to deliver that transformation. So that's why this event is important. I think our presence here is important. The presence of Minister Noonan here is important, as it is important for all the other countries and all the other groups to be here. So I'm going to leave it at that, and thanks again for turning up and showing interest in this. And despite our technological delays, if you have 10 minutes and you want to ask some questions, I'll be happy to take them. So back to you, Kieran, and I'll stop sharing the screen here.
Okay, thanks, Porg. Right, thanks for that. So yeah, we've got a couple of questions coming in the Q&A now, and we'll get to those. So I'll probably dot a few of those in amongst a couple of my own. So I'll start off with one or two of them. So I mean, you mentioned an interesting, looking at it from a global point of view. I mean, this is a global event, and obviously we're there to kind of bring it back to Ireland and raise the profile and encourage action. But from a global point of view, you mentioned that with the 30% figure, we need to protect, one would argue, a global citizen would argue, you know, a lot more than 30% of the Amazon and probably and other ecosystems in the world. So there was a lot of talk at the last COP. In fact, that was mostly what came out of about the loss and damage payments from, you know, the richer part of the world to the countries that have been damaged and suffered losses historically. So there's a similar kind of parallel there with biodiversity. I mean, the countries in the Western Europe, for example, have destroyed a lot of their biodiversity already, whereas a country that still has some left has a sort of obligation maybe to protect a huge amount of it, like more than 30%. So was there any talk at this conference about like that sort of loss and damage language at all? Is anyone calling for it, or is there any talk about it?
Yeah, that's very important, and there's no term like loss and damage that is being used, but the financial element of it is really important. That's why I dwelled a little bit on the finance, on the business side of it, because it will require a lot of money, and it is, you're right, most of that money is going to have to be delivered by the rich countries for the poor countries who still have the really vitally important ecosystems. So the money is really important. The other thing that I think is important that I didn't talk so much about in the slides is our consumption. And this is also recognized in the treaty, because they want to have our ecological footprint via our consumption. So in Ireland, for instance, we often talk about how we've destroyed nature, but yet you go to your shop, your local shop, and it's the shelves are still full and you can buy anything. So basically our consumption is now gone way beyond just destroying ecosystems in Ireland, but is helping to destroy ecosystems in other parts of the world. So this is recognized by the European Commission recently. They announced last week that they were bringing in a law on deforestation, and that they would not allow goods into the European Union that were from basically the products of deforestation. And so they're the kind of measures that I think we need. So setting up a fund to pay countries, but also curbing our own consumption in ways that stop the destruction of ecosystems in other parts of the world.
Yeah, so curbing our sort of exporting our consumption to other parts of the world in some way. I mean, that would have to be combined certainly with payments, because that's going to impact on trade in those countries maybe, and they're going to have losses there. So that's an example of, loss that might need to be allayed by some sort of support. Okay, I just look at the Q&A here. Like, this is actually two kind of linked ones, and it comes down to this bit of what we're just speaking of. So we'll stick to that kind of consumption and the business side of things. So Martin is asking, has there been any talk of degrowth or donut economics at the COP, at the conference? And they make the point that they think what's essential is for humans to truly understand that this world does not revolve around us. So that is, I suppose, part of the whole of donut economics, is that society and the economy sits within the natural world. So yeah, was there any talk of donut economics or of that kind of dangerous word, degrowth, that isn't always that popular?
No. I asked it actually. I was at the first night. There was a session with some of the leading business and NGO people here, and I asked that question of them. Are we talking about growth as such an important indicator of our supposed success and progress? I mean, the answer I got back was very woolly. I mean, they were, maybe rightly saying that there are lots of countries in the world that do need to grow their economy because they can't provide for their people. But the idea that the richer countries need to somehow move away from growth is not being discussed. I haven't heard anything about degrowth. I haven't heard anything really about livestock, which is so important about land use. There is talk about agroecology and the food system impacts, but there's been very little talk specifically about livestock. And the other thing that I think you mentioned there that isn't getting an awful lot of discussion is about our ethics and our ethical approach. So one of the countries here, Bolivia, is a bit of a champion in this regard. They go to these meetings and they really try to insert language around Mother Earth and Papa Macha, I think they call it, around our ethical relationship with all the other life forms on Earth. And they heroically do keep waving this flag about how it is our ethical relationship ultimately. I mean, it is incredible here. Canada is a country that is built on colonialism, and its indigenous peoples are vocal and still very much active. And yet Canada is still destroying they're not oak forests, but they're old forests, particularly in British Columbia. I mean, this is a rich country that doesn't need to be turning ancient natural ecosystems into. Actually, we were shown evidence that some of these trees have been turned into wood pellets, to be shipped across the Atlantic, imported by the European Union, and then used as evidence that we are decarbonizing our economy. I mean, this is insane, but it does come back to our ethics, because we often hear that it's very hard to protect nature if you're poor and you need to, access land and, you need to feed yourself. But what about the rich countries like Sweden and Canada that are not poor, but are still destroying nature anyway? So I think this does come down to the ethics. But you're right, there's an awful lot that really isn't being talked about here.
And on that ethical point, I just thought it'd be interesting that with the Citizens Assembly, calling for rights to nature, to be voted on as a referendum in Ireland. I mean, is there any? You're just saying there isn't much talk on ethics. Is there talk on rights of nature? Like, because I know other countries around the world have made progress on that, but is that a concept being discussed in the COP?
Not really, no. The headline target is living in harmony with nature. Is the kind of the banner headline for the whole gig here, but they don't go into those kinds of
ethical.
And I mean, in many ways, I'm wondering, there are some things that we need in these kind of global agreements, and maybe there are some things that we don't need in them. Just changing the ethics of an entire society is, it's something that happens really from the grassroots up. It doesn't happen because a UN body tells us it needs to happen. But I would say also the UN has recognized the right of people to a healthy environment. So you're getting closer to rights for nature. It's kind of different, but the idea that there might be universal rights around nature and the environment, I think are definitely moving up the agenda.
Yeah. Just a quick one. Someone wants to clarify: will the Minister for Biodiversity not be there? I think Porg, you confirmed Malcolm Noonan is going to attend this.
Yeah, Malcolm Noonan is the Minister for will I get his title right? He's the Heritage, local government and something else, but he is the minister in charge of the National Parks and Wildlife Service. The NPWS are the people who are leading the negotiations here, so he is the appropriate minister. I know we have another minister for biodiversity. Unfortunately, I mean, normally at these COPs you would get all kinds of ministers coming. And you'd get prime ministers and so on, but that's not happening. So I would have loved to have seen more Irish politicians here, not just the minister, but from different parties, so that they can, basically do what we're trying to do and try to bring the message home and integrate it more into our actions at home. Unfortunately, that is not happening.
Yeah, so it'd be amazing to see ministers in charge of agriculture or finance at these meetings. I mean, it's an important enough issue for the world and Ireland to warrant that. But speaking of other politicians, someone has asked a question here. Rachel's saying that they live in a rural county and they feel that all their TDs in most of their counties are very populist and anti-nature. Given the unlikely possibility of convincing them that biodiversity is important, what can I do to achieve change at a local level? So Rachel's kind of wondering if you've given up on the politicians, which certainly we don't at the Irish Wildlife Trust, we keep trying. But what can you do at a local level? I mean, that's a very important question. I suppose you could touch on that. And maybe I'll just link that in with another one is the COP. You had a photo of a protest. I mean, do you think there's an ability, sort of an activation ability, a kind of mobilization ability of this COP to kind of get people active on the ground? Is there a lot of, were the protests over there big? Is there a lot of kind of action there and kind of mobilizing people on the ground? But I suppose we'll talk to Rachel's first. Rachel's question: what can you do?
So the question of what can we do, of course, this is very frustrating when you're faced with politicians who, really don't seem to have any, it's not even that they don't have any understanding. They show no empathy for it. They show no concern for it. There are then politicians who show some empathy for it and they say some nice things, but then they don't actually match that with action. And then there are politicians who are actually, much further along and see the urgency and all the rest of it. So I think we need to be supporting those politicians, the ones that really want to see things happening. And we can do that by, praising them in public, or most importantly, we can vote for them at the next election, and that's at a local level as well as a national level. But of course, we don't want to be just waiting for elections to come around before we can take action. I mean, one of the things I have been really heartened by, really, when you look back over the last 5 years in Ireland, there's been a huge development of local community initiatives. They come in different forms. People automatically think of tidy towns with this stuff, but really there's been a lot of smaller community groups forming around maybe particular areas, protecting bogs, cleaning their coastlines. And these were groups that haven't been there before. And so I would say, try to find your local group that's working on this stuff and get involved. We all have some kind of ability to get actively involved in this area, and how active depends entirely on you and your circumstances. But until we do get actively involved, whether that's protesting or joining community groups, or ringing our local politician or whatever, but then we won't see the changes that we need. It kind of points to the way that the all of government approach really is very much tied in with the all of society approach. I mean, we know from past experience in Ireland that society tends to move ahead of the politicians. And I think that's one of the great takeaways from the Citizens' Assembly, is that I think the people in Ireland generally, when they're given the information, they are far ahead of a lot of what we hear from our politicians. Your other question about the protests, I mean, I thought the protest was pretty big. Climate protests tend to be bigger.
Yeah.
But still, I thought this was a pretty big protest, and it was really freezing. I can tell you, it was -10 degrees here on Saturday. So, people did make an effort to come out. And there's also been smaller protests around the city. The security has been phenomenally heavy, for whatever reason, because there are no senior politicians here at the moment. So I don't know why they're being so strict, but there's very, very heavy security. And the one little protest I saw on the first day was an anti-capitalist protest, and sure, it had more policemen on horses and motorbikes and everything than there were actual protests. But yeah, I mean, I think there was even a protest in Dublin last Saturday or Friday from Extinction Rebellion, and all of these things are needed and are really welcome.
Okay, there's loads of questions here. We'll see if we can touch on a few more if you've time for it. Do you?
Oh, I have time. Yeah, don't worry.
Excellent. Yeah, so I think we'll grab a few more. Maybe just a quick one. Someone is asking, is there any talk about the producer pays? And I was wondering as well, you mentioned there was very little talk about tax. So I mean, there was no talk of producer pays, or kind of like a step towards something like a carbon tax for biodiversity. That's just not happening at the COP from what you can see so far.
Well, I mean, I think these are financial instruments that governments have available to them. The Executive Secretary, Elizabeth Marema, did say yesterday that she felt that taxes are a very important tool to be used, and there is the polluter pays principle, as you point out. Of course, taxes, it's an enormously sensitive issue. And when people hear the word tax, they automatically think about income tax or consumption taxes. But taxes can come in different forms, and you can tax corporations, you can tax pollution and redistribute the earnings from that tax into things that would promote behavioral change, for instance. I mean, we see that with the carbon tax at home. And taxes do work. If they're done properly, they do work. But obviously, in the age that we live in, I think there'll be very little tolerance for increasing consumer prices for anything to pay for this. I think also the other thing is that we don't want to, I wouldn't want to give the impression that saving nature is somehow really expensive and it's going to cost us a fortune. As pointed out on the subsidies, we already spend a fortune on farming and forestry and fossil fuels and fishing that is absolutely eating nature for breakfast. And that's why I think an enormous prize would be if we could redirect those subsidies so that they are promoting nature recovery rather than nature destruction, because then that's completely cost neutral. Or actually, I mean, it would be cost benefit, because it's been shown also that nature recovery does bring an economic dividend at a local level, and health impacts and all kinds of things. So I wouldn't, I think an argument in the climate side of things, maybe the climate denier side of things has successfully got this message into people's heads that, oh, this is all about taxation and it's about making your life harder. Whereas I don't think there's a need for that narrative at all. I think this could be done very easily. Of course, then we're into the issue about facing up to the lobbyists, the people who the WWF said weren't here, but of course they're here. And we know from at home at a very local level and at a European level, there's huge lobbying effort goes into maintaining subsidies and keeping them flowing in the same direction. We saw that with the CAP, which the farming organizations were more or less successful in maintaining the vast amounts of public money that go into maintaining production rather than helping to transition to a healthy food system.
Yeah. Okay, well, we won't spend, as you said, it's not all about tax. So there's one suggestion here from Liam about a net biodiversity gain, which appears to be a sort of a charge for large infrastructure development that might damage biodiversity, that they pay for a positive project elsewhere in the country, in the UK. So that's an interesting idea. It's a sort of like a sort of a tax on industry, but that actually creates a net biodiversity gain. Interesting concept.
Well, that's slightly different. That is this is like offsetting for nature, so that a developer can say, okay, I need to destroy this nature over here, but we're going to put money into a nature bank, and that bank will invest in nature restoration somewhere else. They've legislated for it in the UK, as far as I know, but it has been absolutely condemned because again, we're back into the offsetting argument. The same argument is being used about nature-based solutions, or the new one here is about nature positive. You see posters for nature positive all over the place. And as somebody pointed out, these are marketers' favorite words. Nature positive. Who would be against nature positive? But they can be smoke screens for business as usual, and allowing businesses then just to tokenistically, claim that they're not doing any harm when that's not the case.
Yeah, it can kind of decouple the argument or hide the argument that actually one of the goals of this COP is to have like sort of sustainable management of our landscape, agriculture, forestry. So that should be the goal, is actually have the management sustainable in the first place, rather than people getting to pay to do unsustainable things. I think that's a good point. There's a couple of questions about sort of local issues before we just get back to the local, maybe. So you were talking about how the 1.5 for nature is helpful in the climate conversation, and we've the 30 by 30 is sort of a new kind of a rallying cry, or even 50 by 30, even better. So protected areas are really important, and there was a nice announcement today by our government that they're going to increase marine protected areas in Ireland. So, like, is there any, like, from your experience, any sort of best case examples maybe to give people a little hope that protected areas can work? Because they're such having a figure like a goal, they are kind of a unifying goal that we want to protect 30%. It's something people can get behind. So but while protected areas have their issues, but I mean, would you say protected areas overall are a good concept? And have you any maybe examples of where they've worked well overseas or in Ireland?
Oh yeah, and I mean this is the thing. I mean, protected areas are a really, really important tool for nature conservation, and you know that has been demonstrated in many countries, in many areas of the world. So the principle is not debated. It is the form of conservation that is debated. I mean, the best example I think we have in Ireland is still the burren, and the burren is probably a bit worn out being used as an example for everything that's wonderful in the world. But
Yeah.
that's probably because we just don't have that many other
Other.
great examples that the burren. But the burren, a lot of the burren is protected, not all of it, but it was the protected area bit of it that was able to channel into the finance. They were able to tap into an EU fund for nature protection, and that brought money into the local area, and then it was supported by the government. So so that is a really good example. Another great example in Ireland is Abbey Leaks Bog, where we were last a couple of weeks ago, Kieran. And Abbey Leaks Bog, but Abbey Leaks Bog isn't a protected area, but it shows how a local community was willing to stand up for protecting its local nature area, has done absolutely amazing work in terms of not just science, but actual restoration measures that they have shown to work. I mean, this is just an absolutely amazing example. But they have faced all kinds of obstacles along the way. And it goes to show also how if we were to make the protected area goal workable with people, putting the supports in so people could create their own local nature reserve, help to manage it, tap into the scientific support, tap into the bureaucratic support, I think it'd be hugely popular. Who wouldn't want to live beside a nature reserve? Who wouldn't want to be involved in such an amazing project for the century that we're in? I think we have to stop looking at these kinds of ideas as burdensome and divisive. I think they could be hugely popular and uniting for everybody. I think it'd be a great all-island project, actually, you know, to bring nature back to the island of Ireland, 30–40% of our country in protected areas for nature. I think that could be the project of the century for Ireland. But unfortunately, we're not there yet. That has to come from a local level, but definitely there's lots of good examples out there.
For sure, yeah, and I think, as you said, that when you get the community engagement right, or when you get the community leading, you don't always even need the designation of a protected area, like in Abbey Leaks, where it's been, the biodiversity is increasing there, and the protection has increased without any designation by the government. So it just shows you, yeah, I guess the focus should be on local engagement and community engagement.
But we also need to bear in mind that the legal protection is really important, because a lot of these places do require rules about what happens, and ultimately rules need to be enforced. And there's no substitute for having the law behind you then if you do need to enforce the rules. So the actual legal protection is still really important.
Yeah. Grant, I think we'll just do one or two more because it's getting close to 8:30 now. But so many questions, we probably won't get through them all. Pori, can you see the list, by the way, just in case you wanted to pick one you liked?
I'm looking at them, Kieran. I've been letting you.
Well, I've got one anyway that it's in relation to Ireland, and do you see a role for local government? Some county councils have excellent biodiversity strategies on paper, and others have nothing. Local people perhaps interact more with their local councillors in rural Ireland than with TDs. So can we relate this to the COP? I guess maybe some of the high goals of the COP will actually have to come down, be written into national biodiversity plans, but then for action to really happen, it needs to be at a local council level. So yeah, do you see a role for the local government? Barbara wants to know.
Yeah, totally. And I think the way that the work here in Montreal will get down to local authority level is through our National Biodiversity Action Plan. because from that, their local authorities can produce their own county biodiversity action plan. A number of them have been producing these plans for a long time. But the problem is that the local authorities really are not resourced to do this kind of stuff. One of the leading counties in the country, I think, on this is Fingal. And I saw yesterday that Fingal are hiring 3 or 4 people now, 3 or 4 ecologists. They're going to have a marine biodiversity officer. I'm not sure if that's the correct title, but they're going to have, they've obviously been able to find more resources to put into it. We saw at the Citizens Assembly, there was a presentation from a speaker from Utrecht in Holland. And he was asked, how many staff does the city have that are ecologists and are working on making the city biodiversity friendly? And his answer was 15. There were 15 people just working for the city. I mean, most county councils in Ireland don't have anybody, you know, 0. So if you're not going to, so the government, the central government needs to resource local authorities to do that. But I mean, we've seen time and again, when you do provide the resources, there's huge enthusiasm to take this up. People are crying out to have biodiversity officers, to have ecologists working in their planning departments and their roads departments and their heritage departments, so that they can bring this stuff down to the local level. So there is a huge role to play for local authorities, but the central government will have to fund it ultimately.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a little bit of progress on biodiversity offices happening around the country, but really I think people have said time and again, it's more a biodiversity team that's probably needed in most counties rather than just one person in isolation. Any questions there that you'd like to look at before we finish? There's still a few left. I'll just have a look myself. Some are more just comments, really.
Yeah, well, I see there's a question there from Janine who says, can the different COPs be done together? Would it be beneficial? I mean, I think it would be, but to be honest, I don't think just the way that the structures have been put in place at this stage, I don't see there really being any going back on it. I mean, we have seen in the climate COPs, the last 2 climate COPs had a lot more emphasis on biodiversity. And there will be a target in the deal that's being done here in Canada on climate change, on using nature to take carbon out of the air, which is an essential component of meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement. So there's more work being done to bring the 2 issues together, which is welcome. But I mean, I think we have a lot to do in the public sphere to explain that to local people. I don't think it's really being properly communicated. I think a good example is how we're doing wind energy and the need to create offshore wind developments, for instance, for decarbonization, or even on land where where peatlands are coming under a lot of pressure from wind developments. And these are sites that will be better promoted for biodiversity because they also have climate benefits. So, so I think there's a lot to be done in that regard about bringing all of our different problems together. And of course, we have pollution problems as well that are not unrelated, and so we have to start seeing these things as one, which is why I go around wearing this button here for the Sustainable Development Goals, which is about trying to see the different perspectives, whether that's different environmental perspectives, but also different human perspectives. And I think that's a valuable way to look at these issues.
Great, and that kind of covered one of our questions there. Can biodiversity and renewable energy work together? I think they can, but yeah, you need to realize that, as I say, biodiversity and climate are linked, and it's not always the best use. Renewable energy, when maybe the particular site will be better serving biodiversity and climate by staying as it is. Unless, I don't know if you want to add anything more to that one.
No. I mean, I think we have to get it right. It's not an option. We have to decarbonize. We have to do it in a way that protects biodiversity. And the way we do that is through good planning. It's not just wind turbines. We see plantation forestry being sold as a simplistic way of removing carbon from the air. We see markets opening for biomass, like I mentioned, ancient trees being chopped down to turn into, and it's been called green energy. I mean, this is not a solution. There's a term for it. It's called maladaptation. This is what they refer to it in the IPCC. It's basically really, really bad ideas that are being sold as good ideas.
Maladaptation. It's good to know. Yeah. Okay, I think we should probably wrap up because it's getting late. But we could talk about this all night. And what time is it over? What's it like in Canada?
It's 8:30. No, wait, no, it's 8:30 where you are. It's 3:30 here today.
Okay, so you're going back to the COP, or have you got the rest of the day off?
Oh, I'll be working hours more here. Don't worry.
Okay, well, maybe we'll finish on, I mean, how regular are the COPs? What do we want to see maybe have happened in Ireland and in the world by the time the next biodiversity COP happens?
Well, I mean, I think even by next week, we want to see a deal that is credible. I think there will, of course, be people who will criticize it. It probably won't go far enough, but it might get us on the, it might be like Paris in terms of just getting us on the right road. And I think that'd be crucial. The next COP is going to be in Turkey in 2 years' time. I think if we're at that, saying that, we've actually started to implement a lot of these things on subsidies and protected areas and so on. That's the kind of progress that we need. But we really have to get on with it. It's already, nearly 2023, and we don't have forever to be having meetings about what we're going to do about it, because nature has different ideas.
Certainly not. And what is the timeline for this meeting then, just before we go, just to let people know what to look out for in the papers and the news on our social media coming back from this COP? Is it are we expecting a deal next Friday, or does it run into the weekend? Or
it runs into the weekend. So we're moving into now what's called the high level segment. This is where ministers will be coming, and what they'll be hoping the knottier issues will get thrashed out. I think the Canadian Prime Minister is coming, Justin Trudeau, either tomorrow or Thursday, and that might help to bring some focus on it. But definitely by Monday, I think we will see it wrapped up.
Okay. Great. All right. Well, we'll leave it there for now. We will be posting this video on our YouTube channel, the Irish Wildlife Trust YouTube channel, and on our website as well, iwt.ie. And if you want to stay in touch with what's happening day to day in the COP, Porg has been posting a video diary, which we're sharing on our social media, which you can check out on our social media. So just to finish up, if anyone does like the work of the Irish Wildlife Trust, these webinars and our advocacy work and our work in general, do pop onto our website and hit the join button to support our work and our charities work. And that's all. I'll say goodnight. I'll say thank you to Porg, and thanks to everyone for tuning in, and we'll see you at another webinar.
Thanks, Kieran. Good night, everybody.
Thanks. Good night, all.